4 years ago, federal scientists warned us that Florida would face more toxic algae blooms in fresh water and more intense red tide blooms along the coast. They said climate change would make it worse than it otherwise would be because the organisms that cause these blooms need nutrients and heat. And as water gets hotter, it creates a better climate for these organisms to grow.
We should not ignore the impacts that human activities do have in exacerbating the red tide event.
Now, federal scientists say Florida is about to get whacked again. Scientists from 13 federal departments and agencies say man-made pollution is causing the climate to change, and this change is accelerating. The evidence, they say, is overwhelming. This is accepted science. For Florida, the scientists say the Zika outbreak from a couple of years ago is just the start. They warn of growing outbreaks of mosquito-borne diseases that will be transmitted year-round in South Florida. And they warn of losing coral reefs and more extreme rainfalls and much more flooding and more intense hurricanes. And with rising sea levels, a broader swath of storm surge, plus a growing invasion of Burmese pythons and Brazilian peppers, plus more intense toxic algae blooms that scientists have linked to liver damage and neurodegenerative diseases like ALS. Not to mention huge losses to fishing, farming, and tourism industries, which brings us to President Trump.
They say economic impact is devastating.
Yeah, I don't believe it.
You don't believe it?
No, I don't believe it.
Trump previously called climate change nonsense, among other things, and a hoax perpetrated by China to try to trick us into reducing our pollution. And then last week, conflating weather with climate change, he tweeted that brutal and extended cold blasts should shatter all records, whatever happened to global warming. But Trump is not alone in dismissing or ignoring the threat here. In a time in which a lot of people seem to have difficulty distinguishing fact from belief, voters have elected a lot of leaders who either don't believe or disregard the evidence that our economy, our health, and our quality of lives are at risk. For example, outgoing Governor Rick Scott said he had no plan for this.
Governor, what's your plan for dealing with global climate change?
And he dodged questions about climate change for years.
Do you believe that human activity is causing our climate to change?
So I had a very good meeting yesterday.
Did you believe the case that the scientists were making on climate change?
Well, look, I'm not an expert in this, so.
And after allegedly banning his staff from even saying the words climate change, his top natural disaster manager could not bring himself to even say the words.
Demanding that states have a climate change plan.
In the next iterations of them, will require to have language to that effect.
What were those words you were using? I used climate change.
Future versions of our mitigation plan will be required to have language discussing that issue.
What issue is that?
The issue that you mentioned earlier regarding
so much.
Voters then rewarded Governor Scott by sending him to the United States Senate, where he will now have a leading voice on climate change policy across the nation. In a Pew study, only 3% of voters ranked our environment as our biggest problem. And we've shown you how that drives policy decisions in Washington and Tallahassee time and time again. For example, Florida has abandoned environmental regulations embraced by Republicans like Jeb Bush and Democrats like Bob Graham for decades. And remember how Hurricane Andrew drove Florida to beef up its building code?
Your roof, the entire house is particle board. When it gets wet, it just completely falls apart.
Consumer watchdogs now say the legislature has made changes that could weaken the building code in the years yet ahead when the federal scientists say more intense storms are coming.
You could have homes that weren't built as strong as they could have been. The worst case scenario could be we could be back where we were around the time of Hurricane Andrew, where different jurisdictions are upholding different standards.
Florida is now at a fork in the road. Florida now has, of course, a new governor and new leadership in the House and Senate. And though Governor-elect DeSantis opposes carbon taxes and approaches that Democrats have promoted to address climate change, he said he accepts the warnings about climate change from the scientists, and he is open to finding new ways to address it. The scientist report suggests DeSantis will be judged by what he does or does not do as the next governor of Florida.